Let's start. Thanks for joining us today. We have a distinguished guest from the Czech Republic, but he's Italian, let's say. Under our public lecture series, Debating the Global Talk series, which in this talk, Debating the Global Talk series, we are mostly discussing the issues relating to the international politics, global politics, which affect the attitude of the states and how they affect on the humanity and the global politics. And today we have Francesco Giumelli. Hopefully today I said correctly. We'll speak about the UN sanctions and the UN and the EU sanctions after the Cold War, how these sanctions are working in coercing, constraining and signalling, how they are working on it. And before leaving the floor to Francesco, I want to give a short view of him. Very short, I will do it for sure. But he's expert on the international sanctions. He did his PhD on it, and then he completed his PhD at University of Florence. Then he made his postdoc studies on the peace studies and then the international sanctions in Notre Dame University, US. For a year, you were there for a year, right? Then now, currently, he's an assistant professor at the Metropolitan University of Prague and also Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute of Badia Fiesole, Florence. Sorry, I forgot it. And now, today he will speak about the UN sanctions and the EU sanctions, more focusing on the cases, how they are affected the global politics and the attitudes of the states. The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon and thank you very much for coming in this beautiful day. It's even more rewarding when people show up when they could actually have been doing something else. But it's a pleasure, and thank you again, Muzafer, for the invitation. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to tell you a bit of what I've been working on and a bit of what my lessons learned of studying sanctions have been. As you can see from the title, basically it's supposed to present more or less what it's in here. This is a book that came out last November from ECPR Press. The title is up there, so there is no need for me to read it again. But there is need for you to buy it, so please make sure that you buy a couple of copies also for Christmas, for whatever you want to give it as a present. This is in reality more an academic effort than a policy relevant work. And that's why today I will not be focusing only on these, but it will basically, and please do interrupt me whenever we want. The more we make it as a discussion, the more is going to be useful for me to know what you think, what's your take, what are the doubts of people who do not study sanctions, in case you do not study sanctions, and also I hope for you to share some of what I've been doing in the past 7 years, more or less. One premise is that this work has also been useful. The book is more, let's say, academic. There is also a lot of case studies on the UN and EU sanctions after the Cold War, so if you read it, you'll see that basically you will have an idea what happened in the past 20 years in the field of sanctions. It's mostly on international organizations, UN and EU, and therefore you can also draw lessons on what other international organizations have been doing. But it's also relevant for nation states. That's something that I did not study directly, so I will not be able to tell you. I know, for example, the most important cases of what's going on today is Iran, Syria, and these cases as well, and other cases as well. about, for example, what the US did or what other states have been doing. But my research was basically focused on international organizations. That doesn't mean that this is a purely theoretical and academic work. To probably also the catchy title, there was also have been acknowledged. This work has been acknowledged also in the policy, in the practitioners' world, as we have been working in a consortium with other universities and think tanks, and we are working with the United Nations and the European Union and a few governments here and there because they want to know more about this, when they work, what they do, what sanctions are, what we can do actually with sanctions in the 21st century. And this is more or less what I will be talking today. I will introduce briefly the subjects, but then again, I really want you to interrupt me whenever you have doubts, anything, so we can build a discussion on that. So again, there is a policy relevance, so try also to get the concepts, especially the initial one, as tools to analyze and understand the real world. That's what concepts are for, to produce what we call usable knowledge that can actually be useful to make decisions. And my understanding of the academia is that we are not supposed to make decisions, otherwise we would be politicians, practitioners. We are supposed to provide the analytical tools for the practitioners to make decisions. That's what this work is supposed to do. Create an analytical framework, create concepts, tools for people, practitioners, and also individual people to make their own mind and judgment. Political decisions are informed decisions with judgment, and the judgment is what academics cannot really provide. It is up to the politicians or to each individual to basically feel what we cannot do with to feel the decisions with something that academics cannot do. But again, these concepts I think have been acknowledged, and I think they're useful, and as we will see, we can discuss. So again, trying to frame the problem, the idea of sanctions is basically anytime there is an international crisis, you can name any of the country, any of the crises, there is a sanction taught or mentioned. Someone proposes a sanction. This makes, of course, sanctions very relevant and present in all. When you open a newspaper, you basically, before we were walking in the library, and the first page of the daily news.
Today, someone and Daily News.
Yeah, the Daily News. Erdogan was actually calling for the UN to act on Syria, and I'm sure that if I had the time to read the article, he was going to talk about sanctions at some point in the article. If you read the article, yeah. Okay, so as you can see, this is a very common tool that is used and discussed in the foreign policy realms. The problem that I see is that this is discussed with the vocabulary, with terms, with ideas of sanctions that date back decades ago. I mean, how we see sanctions, how we discuss them is basically outdated. And that makes us not able to understand the new evolution of sanctions, what sanctions are today, how they are used, and also the problems. What we are asking sanctions to do is something radically different from what we asked sanctions to do in the past. And that's why we need new terms, we need new ideas, we need new ways of shaping the debate, also because the majority of the debate of the literature holds that sanctions do not work. And then, as I was just mentioning, if you open a newspaper, everybody talks about sanctions. So why everybody wants them if they don't work? And my position is that basically how we evaluated the success of sanctions was simply wrong. We just need to reframe the debate in order to make us understand what sanctions can do. And only when we understand what sanctions can do, then we can talk and we can reason whether they work and whether this is an effective tool of foreign policy. My position, that's something that I will argue here, and that's something that I also argue in the book, is that sanctions are a very useful foreign policy tool. There are many reasons, because you can use it in different contexts, because you can basically, especially with the evolution of sanctions, what we call targeted sanctions, we can actually play with it and make sure that you impose different things in different moments. It's potentially cheaper than the use of force, and you can also use it in different contexts. Democracy promotion, crisis management. We talked yesterday also about peace-building measures. So there are ways in which you can actually use sanctions. And again, I say this because I think that if we measure success in a different way, and then we will understand better what sanctions can do. That's the key, understanding what sanctions can do and when. This is what we can actually reason. And that's the right question, whether we talk about Iran. I mean, asking whether we can impose sanctions on Iran today is basically trying, the key to reach the answer is understanding what we want from sanctions being imposed on Iran and what actually can sanctions achieve. That's a key element. If we do not reason in that terms, it's very difficult from us to impose sanctions. To answer the question whether imposing sanctions on Iran is a good idea or a bad idea. Actually, the Iranian case is something that we can talk quite widely here. It's also one of the cases of which everybody talks about. For example, that the last round of sanctions imposed since in the past couple of months did not see a UN resolution being approved on the Iranian case. So this is another interesting aspect, how we can see, nevertheless, many states are talking about sanctions on Iran, and actually many states and international actors are actually using sanctions. So it's very interesting to discuss this case, and we can do that more extensively, especially in the Q&A, for us to find out what sanctions can achieve, what are the expectations, what we call the unintended effect of imposing sanctions. Sometimes tools can also foreign policy tools can backfire compared to what we actually want to achieve. And sanctions in the case of Iran, as much in the case of Syria, can actually, and that can happen. This is basically the structure of the presentation, and we will go through what is a sanction, what are targeted sanctions, and we will talk about cases of the UN. I will be pretty quick in the first part, and then I will spend more time in talking about the UN, the EU, opportunities and challenges, but again, I'll try to bring new cases in the discussion that will lead us then to the evaluation of success, how I think that success and how I think that the effectiveness of sanctions should be measured. What sanctions used to be in the past are basically what we used to refer to the names, to the word of embargo. Basically, stopping the trade with one entire country, or if we go before the Westphalia system, states, city-states, and also kingdom, if we want to talk, in all terms. Sanctions used to be comprehensive. The entire community was targeted. Sanctions were non-discriminatory. There are sanctions on Iran. It's not too much. The idea is not too much who is going to be hurt. The economy is supposed to be hurt, and there is not too much discussion who is going to physically pay the consequences for this action. And then the other part of the discussion is whether sanctions are used as a prelude to war or as an alternative to war, whether it's basically a step short of use of force, or we impose sanctions because we do not want to use the military instrument. These are basically the key points. I want only one thing, that, as you can see in the second line, there is the senders and targets. I will be referring to this terminology. Senders are the actors that actually impose sanctions, while targets are the actors that receive the sanctions. Examples in history: Megarian decree when Athens decided to cut off the city of Megara from the trade with Athens because they did not ally with them in the war with Sparta. The UN sanctions on Iraq, 1990. After the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the UN decided to stop all the trades with Iraq. And that is another idea of what we think about sanctions. What we used to think about sanctions, because in the early 90s something changed. Basically, I put there 4 cases in which the United Nations imposed sanctions to basically sustain a transition to what we used to call the New World Order. And especially the cases of Iraq and Haiti were very crucial. In the case of Iraq and Haiti, the overall understanding of sanctions was pretty negative. We already came from a long debate from the 70s and the 80s where people believed the sanctions did not work. So there was a negative understanding, negative view of this foreign policy tool. Iraq, Saddam was not withdrawing from Kuwait, even if there was a very heavy embargo imposed on Iraq. Haiti, the military junta of Raúl Cedras, was not actually changing their mind because of the heavy sanctions of the UN and before the organization of the American state imposed from 1992 to 1994, and the UN stepped in 1993 and 1994. So again, very heavy sanctions, not political results. Negative view of sanctions. Who was paying the consequences of these sanctions? Civilians, innocent civilians, people, Haitians, the Iraqis that were basically not really involved in the decision-making process, and so the idea was not only sanctions do not change the political behavior of the bad guys, but they also kill civilians. So it doesn't make too much sense. Third, there is a normative change in the 90s. In the 90s, we go from the idea that individuals do not play any role in the international system because we have states. The Westphalian system, only states are important actors. In the early 90s, we start to think that individuals have to become accountable for what they decide in the international system. We talk about the tribunals, the ad hoc tribunals, Rwanda, Yugoslavia. Individuals become responsible for what they do, not because they are members, not because they are generals of some army or because they are prime ministers of some states. Remember, Saddam and Milosevic were not hit by sanctions in the early 90s. Only the entire states were Iraq, Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia in that case, were hit by the sanctions. Okay, that's a fundamental change. Something changed in the 90s. There was the idea that we needed to change sanctions because they were not working, they were harming civilians, but how if we cannot sanction anybody but states? That small part changed. We started to introduce this, the concept of what we call targeted sanctions. The idea is to minimize the impact on the innocent civilians and to maximize the impact of sanctions on so-called the bad guys, the guys that we think are doing something that we don't want them to do. Okay, that is the entire concept of targeted sanctions. And basically, in practice, sanctions means targeting individuals, non-state actors, so political parties, companies, only regions of certain states. Okay, so you can in the DRC, the arms embargo hits only the Ituri region, the northeastern part of Congo. In the Darfur, the arms embargo is in the Sudan. The arms embargo is only for the Darfur. It's not for the entire country. In Angola, the target of the measures was only UNITA, the political party that was basically undermining the process. Only individuals. And nowadays, well, in Syria, what the European Union has done has sanctions a couple of weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, what the newspapers have titled the women of the Assad's family, the mom, the sisters, the wife, individuals, only individuals, because this is the more direct relations that you can have in between the people that you want to hit and the entire societies. These are, generally speaking, the type of sanctions you can impose: arms embargoes, economic boycotts, financial restrictions, and travel ban. Here you can also see cases in which these type of sanctions have been imposed, both from the UN and the EU cases. So you can see Syria and the DRC from the UN, Syria for the EU, Iran from the UN, and Burma, Myanmar from the EU. Financial restrictions, Belarus, the EU. When I talk about financial restrictions, it's basically freezing bank accounts, freezing transactions. Another financial sanction is banning certain services. In the case of Iran, it's very interesting how one of the most effective ban is on insurance companies. What the European banks, European insurance firms were basically insuring all the shipping of the Iranian goods. By banning the insurance services, sending a boat full of things with no insurance, it's much more risky. And of course, that increases the price of the shipment. And that is basically really affecting what the Iranians can ship in and out. And that goes also much beyond oil, because anything can be on boats. So again, this is a financial service that you can ban with this type of financial measures that before were not allowed, because under the previous interpretation of international law, you could not sanction these or the owner of the ship. Why do you want to sanction? How can you sanction the owner of a ship, since international law says that the ship is part of a country, so you have to sanction the country? In this case, you can. Well, in the past 20 years, there is this shape, this new form of the international law, in which you can also target these companies. And then travel bans. Basically, you're not allowed to travel. And for certain things, traveling is very important. If you are hosted in Afghanistan and you want to fly a couple of planes on buildings in New York, you have to go to New York. And so if you cannot travel that easily or freely, and then it's more difficult to do bad things according to who decides who are doing the bad things and this. But this is another story. And Zimbabwe is a case of the European Union. And in the European Union, it's very interesting how you see. Well, I have to say that I have to remember that Turkey is also part of 90% of the sanctions that the European Union imposes, because the associate countries of the European Union tend to side with the European Union when the EU makes these decisions, and the EU, of course, has dialogue with associate countries. In the case of Zimbabwe, Turkey is in. In the case of Uzbekistan, it was very interesting how Turkey was in at the beginning. So they basically, in 2005, the European Union imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, on Uzbekistan, because of the events in Andijan in May 2005. In May 2005, there was a protest. There was a military repression of this protest. Events are not clear. I want to be politically correct, because one side says that there was a huge number of casualties. The other side says that there was only collateral damage of a police operation, because these guys were basically having riots and they were threatening the stability of the state. Nevertheless, the EU imposed sanctions. Turkey, after a while, saw that these sanctions were not exactly doing what the Europeans had promised, so they stopped imposing the sanctions. They basically were not implementing those sanctions after 2006, 2007. So sometimes you see exactly the same complete coherent message from Turkey with the EU. Other times you see also this degree of freedom, as you can also see in Iran. In the case of Iran, there is not UN sanction, but there is a very strong unilateral US sanction, and the US is also trying to convince many allies in the EU and many other buyers, basically the main buyers of oil from Iran, South Korea, Japan, India and China, to stop buying oil from Iran. And this is a unilateral effort. Turkey has a different stand on that for different reasons that we can discuss. And in that case, again, Turkey is playing another role and is trying to influence also what the EU does in a different way than what the EU would like to do. The EU imposed a full embargo on oil starting July 1st, and Turkey is basically not agreeing with that, also because a lot of oil that Turkey uses comes from Iran. And of course, if you cannot replace that, and then somehow you need oil, so somewhere you have to do it. The oil is a very tricky tool when you talk about sanctions, because in a way, if you stop buying it and then it's very expensive, it's a cost. Well, if you're selling oil and then you have a tool like Russian gas, it's a geopolitical tool. You simply can decide where you want to sell it. But at the same time, you need to sell it. It's not that if you stop selling it and you can drink it, right? You cannot do anything with oil unless someone is willing to pay for it. So you can also see how the Iranians, for example, now stop the trade, the sale, anticipating the EU reaction to France and the UK. They're not sending the UK unilaterally. The French and the Brits could have bought oil until June 30th from Iran. The Iranians decided unilaterally to stop selling oil to these two countries. But of course, again, there is this game. On the one hand, the price of oil goes up. That's a simple economic law. If the supply of one good decreases, the price goes up. That's what's happening actually. In January, the price of barrel of oil was $100 roughly. Now it's $128 the last time I checked. $30 in 3 months, in 4 months. It's quite a peak. And this is also a very interesting element when we talk about Iran. If you impose a sanction on oil, they will sell less oil. But what happens if the price of oil goes up? It might happen that you actually help them to make more money. Because if the price of oil goes up higher than how much they're actually selling less, and then they will actually, at the end of the day, make more money than what they were making before. And in a way, you're using them, you're helping them to make more money first, and second, to sell less, which means that they will have more in the future, and they can last longer, okay? So these are all these arguments that we can also play with sanctions when we talk about these forms of sanctions. Tell me when I'm talking too much? Oh, okay. Basically, this is only a slide, and then I will also tell you a couple of things more later of what I've been studying. The UN can impose measures on sanctions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is basically the same chapter that can be used for the use of force. It's basically the article before if you read the Charter of the United Nations. It is the Security Council, which means international law, jus cogens, and it has imposed in the last 20 years more or less 20 sanctions, 20 cases of sanctions. This is also very interesting. From 1945 to 1991, the UN imposed sanctions on 2 occasions, Southern Rhodesia and South Africa. Always South. Because certain members had something very, they had an interest on those 2 countries. But again, 2 cases in 45 years. From 1992 to up until today, 20 cases. So again, that's why some scholars have called the UN the sanctions decades for the United Nations, because they've been using sanctions quite oftenly. That's interesting for any of you who want to study sanctions. There is a lot of material to review if you want, and let me know, please. In the case of the European Union, these are CFSP measures. There are, especially after Lisbon, there are different procedures. There are sanctions that can be imposed by the Council, regardless from what the Parliament says. But there are also other sanctions, especially the counter-terrorist measures, that have to be also imposed by the Parliament. So again, as you can see, there is a review process. In the European Union, the Court of Justice can review the decisions made by the European Union, so anybody can appeal against those decisions. In the case of the UN, there are 2 ways of basically for individuals to reflect and to react. The one is the focal point for the listing. So if you are listed and you want to be delisted, and then you can contact this focal point. If you're not an Al-Qaeda member, well, if you're not accused, if you are accused of being an Al-Qaeda member, if you are an Al-Qaeda member, it's more problematic. But if you are accused of being an Al-Qaeda member, and then you can go to the ombudsperson, who's a new figure, and it's a very interesting figure and institution for who wants to study international institutions. And the power of the ombudsperson, I think, happens to be Brazilian. And the ombudsperson can act when the Security Council is unwilling or incapable of deciding, which is a formulation used for the International Criminal Court, but we can talk in details later. These procedures were put in place because, again, think about the revolution. One thing is to sanction Southern Rhodesia. You sanction an entire country. One thing is to sanction South Africa. One thing is to sanction Assad's mom. Why does she have to be, why cannot she pay for her food or for her things? Because the son is doing something wrong. It's like you park your car in a tow car, in a place where you're not supposed to park, and they arrest your father or your mother or your sister. Okay, that is exactly what's going on in the case of international sanctions for targeting. They're targeting individuals. They're targeting people that might not have anything to do with the wrongdoings. They might also make mistakes, right? So they might target you because you happen to have the same name that a very bad person that is actually a terrorist working with Al-Qaeda. Okay, that is one thing that we will also talk. But this is just to justify the second part, the procedures, how the procedures are changing. And I think that this is a very interesting case that we can discuss for how they've been changed. 10 minutes. Wow. Here you can see basically 4 reasons which we already talked about, so I will not stop too much. But they are more flexible. These type of sanctioning can really be more flexible, because if you can think of, for example, nowadays the Security Council decides on a list of individuals that are responsible of wrongdoings. People that are basically supposed to be the bad guys. The list can go from one person, from no one. The case of Hariri, the Hariri murder, has a UN sanctions as soon as the tribunal decides who is responsible for that, and then the Security Council has already imposed sanctions on these people. The tribunal still did not decide who is the responsible for the Hariri murder in Lebanon, so we do not have the actual individuals, but we have sanctions. So sanctions can go from no individual to hundreds of individuals. And you can play with the list. It's a very flexible tool. You can decide what to impose. You can always you can use it in different contexts. It's cheaper because sanctioning, preventing the travels of the bad guys basically allow you to not to lose any money. Iran, a couple of weeks ago bought 3 tons of wheat from the U.S. Okay, so they are buying wheat things from the U.S. even today, as long as things are not covered by the sanctions. Everything's from wheat, and the Americans sell them. So it's really interesting how to see all these things. So So it's potentially cheaper, and then the reason why I think sometimes they'll be more effective, because you can also play with the undesired effects. I told you about the price of oil that can go up, and this is also interesting because the Iranian case might be one of the least targeted sanctions that we've seen in the past 20 years. Iran, Syria, and another very interesting case is the European Union action in Cote d'Ivoire to change the regime, to arrest Gbagbo. The sanctions that have been imposed on Cote d'Ivoire, this is a case, so I take 30 seconds more. The sanctions that has been imposed on Cote d'Ivoire were basically closing the entire country. There was a financial ban on 2 ports, San Pedro and Abidjan. These 2 ports are basically 90% of the trade of the entire West Africa. And of course, Cote d'Ivoire stopped in 2 days of working. There was no one cargo, because the payments are made through the ports. So if you block the accounts of the ports, nobody could pay the goods, and of course nobody was delivering goods. Would you deliver goods if they don't pay the goods? So anything was stopped. The entire country was basically frozen. That is not exactly the idea of targeted sanctions. There was the idea, it was a mistake, allegedly. They did not know how the things worked. That's another part of the sanction story. They used when there are crises. When there are crises, time is a scarce resource. You do not have it. You have to make a decision in 24 hours, 12 hours. A decision was made to freeze the accounts of the ports, and afterwards they found out that freezing the ports was basically freezing the entire West Africa, the trade in West Africa. And that was again very, very interesting. And these cases are not exactly targeted. So in most of the cases we see targeted sanctions until these 3 cases. And then the UN and the EU have been doing things that might also be countering what we've seen so far. Challenges. What are the problems? State capacity. The more targeted are the sanctions, the more the institutions have to know about the society and to have the capacity of imposing them. Legal challenges. These things that I was talking about before, with the procedures, people appealing against the decisions, might be revolutionary. There is a pending case, the Court of Justice. You might have heard about the Qadi case. Qadi was a Saudi citizen who was included in the list by the United Nations in 2001, after 9/11. After a while, and the European Union received the Security Council resolution in its EU law. It's mandatory. All the states are supposed to receive UN Security Council resolutions and to implement them. Qadi complained. He appealed at the Court of Justice in 2005 in the European Union. In 2008, he won the case. He said that international law gives him some rights that no one can take away from them. For example, the due process. If you have a fine because you park your car somewhere, you must have the right to know why they fined you. You have the explanation. You might have the chance to actually appeal against the decision, because there might be a mistake. You were not there that day parking the car in that place. How can you actually fix the mistake? And all these things are not existing. Assad's mom 10 years ago could not appeal against these decisions. Qadi established the principle. The Court of Justice told Qadi that he is right. The European Union, any time that the EU does anything, has to follow EU regulations, even if it is the Security Council that says certain things. Qadi lost the case. The EU, with a trick, was able to keep Qadi in the list. Qadi appealed again. He won the second case at the Court of First Instance, that now it's the General Court of the European Union. And the court and the European Union institutions appealed against Qadi, against the decision, and now the Court of Justice has to decide. In case the Court of Justice decides against the European Union, we're basically facing a situation in which we have a regional court, because it is a regional court, saying that any time that the Security Council decides anything, it has to follow the laws of the place in which that decision has been applied. And that can happen to Iran, it can happen to Syria, it can happen in any of the over 190 states of the of the international system. And this, of course, is a huge blow to what international law is and how we've thought about a Security Council. The lighter they are, well, the more tailored they are, the easier it is to find evasion techniques. because of course you can imagine how easy to transfer funds here and there, and of course the lighter they are, and also the lighter political value they might receive, they are only symbolic. That's one thing that we always read, only symbolic sanctions, so they don't really want to change. But how do we say whether they are successful or not? And I take 2 minutes and then I'll be done. We basically, and that's the past. It's a bit probably to put in too much expectations of the book, but this is, I think, a good way of putting it. In the past, we used 2 criteria to decide whether sanctions were successful or not. First, behavioral change. There is someone who does something wrong, we impose the sanctions. If that someone does not change the behavior, sanctions fail. Second criteria, objective driven. If there is something the sanctions have to achieve, and then it's a political objective, and then the sanctions somehow achieves it, then it's a success, otherwise it's not a success. I think that there are 4 problems you can see, but the most important element is that sanctions are never used in isolation from other foreign policy tools. So not seeing this difference in between having many foreign policy tools used at the same time and only sanctions used, and that is basically taking away 90% of what actually sanctions can do in the international system. And I argue this in the book here. I argue that using for 3 things. Sanctions can be, and sanctions as much as other foreign policy tools, but this is more for sanctions tools when relations are not too friendly, let's put that in this way. The first dimension of sanctions is coercing, changing the behavior. Sanctions can contribute to change the behavior of a target by changing the cost-benefits calculation. And we can have an example, Syria, or we can have Libya. The UN, Libya 1, 1992. 1988, 1989, there are 2 planes. The famous one is Lockerbie, the one that falls and kills a few hundred people, and in Scotland. 2 Libyan officials are accused of being behind the attack. The United Nations asked Libya to give basically these 2 individuals. The Libyans, they didn't do it for a while, but the only request was to hand in these 2 individuals. Doing that would not have undermined the life of the regime. Gaddafi stayed in power quite healthily for many years after the decision of handing in these 2 suspects. One thing is to ask something that targets can do. Give me those 2 responsible, that we have a trial under international law and we see how it goes. And as a matter of fact, one was accused and one was released after the trial that was eventually held in the Netherlands. Another thing is to ask Assad today, Mr. Assad, you've been there for a long time, you have to leave. We are asking a political actor to change his job. We're asking Al-Qaeda to stop its activity. It's not something the sanctions can do. Well, sanctions in that case, when someone does not want, because he cannot do that thing, because of course Assad is the president and you're asking him to leave, and he will not leave that easily, but sanctions can constrain. So sanctions can, and this is the idea of law enforcement of sanctions can make the life of targets more difficult. And that's what sanctions are used for. In many of the cases, Gbagbo was going to go to jail. Colonel Gaddafi, Libya too. Last year, Gaddafi was supposed to go either to jail or exiled. Anyway, he wasn't going to be happy in doing what the Security Council was asking him to do. And of course he couldn't do it, okay? But we could make the life of this guy more difficult. We could make the life of Gbagbo more difficult. We could make the life of UNITA, Angola, to the conclusion of the civil war, more difficult to get the spare parts of tanks. Well, UNITA is give me 30 seconds for that, but UNITA is a great case because this was a political party that wanted to rule the country. He was able to actually build an entire army. He bought planes from the former Soviet Union countries. He shipped them to Angola. He put them together and he was running planes and helicopters. And he was a political party. The most effective sanctions on them was banning the selling of spare parts to UNITA. Basically, they were not selling components. If you have a tank that has a problem, you need a part of an engine. how can you repair? How can you fix it if you cannot buy those components? Okay, this was one of the most effective. Of course, Jonas Savimbi was not going to give up, because living in that situation was basically his power. But he not being able to run his machine, his military machine, undermined his power, making his life harder. And then signaling. Can we really, Rwanda, 1994, the Security Council has to have 3 decisions: going there with force, imposing sanctions, or do nothing. Do nothing, well, and going there with force, well, you need soldiers. Mogadishu, US, happened the year before. Black Hawk Down, 19 Marines died in the streets of Mogadishu. No single man wanted to go in Rwanda, and Rwanda was pretty much a mess. I mean, if you talk about Darfur as being a mess, Rwanda is a very small place, overly populated. You know that if you put soldiers in the field, you're going to get casualties. There is no way around it. Mogadishu, if you put soldiers downtown Mogadishu, you can have as many planes as you want, but Mogadishu is a nasty place, and you're going to get someone killed. Then you have to justify that in front of your public audience. Nobody wanted to go on the ground. Could you actually afford, from a political perspective, not to do anything? Could the Security Council, after 60 days, after the images of the slaughtering came out, and everybody was watching, and everybody knew in that moment, when the TV went there, before the Security Council could say, we don't know what's going on. So it's difficult to do, it's difficult to act, we don't know what to do, we don't know who is to be blamed. When you see the images of people being slaughtered, could you really not do anything? Not to destroy entirely the credibility of the Security Council, you need to do something about it. You impose sanctions with a signaling purpose. Signaling that the Security Council is doing something about it, or the international community is concerned about something. This is an important dimension of sanctions, as much as any political tools, but sanctions is also, for the political idea that we have for sanctions, is very important, okay? These are arguments that are laid in the book, and we can talk again about the cases. The last slide, I will stop with this. It's basically, again, when we think about sanctions, and targeted sanctions in particular, we have to consider these 3 logics at work. Sanctions want to change the cost-benefits calculation of doing something. Iran, especially up until a couple of years ago, the idea of sanctions was making the construction of nuclear capability in Iran more costly than having nuclear energy built and produced for Iran outside of the territory of Iran. Okay, that's not undermining the regime in Iran. The state could survive, the regime, the people in power could still do the same thing as they are doing now. Nobody would have complained. The request was something that they could have done. The coercion, constraining, undermining what Assad's regime can do, because everybody's been basically going up with a very smart approach, going and giving interviews. Assad has to leave. UK, France, and Germany, the US, everybody has been saying publicly that Assad has to leave. And of course Assad has difficult problems in believing, we were talking over lunch about that, in believing that any other proposals that officially can potentially keep him there is credible if everybody is saying officially that he has to leave his job. That is basically strengthening his capacity. And signaling, the signaling function in international relations is damn important, sorry for the word, is tremendously important, okay? And again, we can talk about cases on that. This is the first dimension, looking at effects, not at the behavioral change or the political objectives. Second, comparative utility. I already gave you an example of Rwanda. The comparative utility is basically, okay, sanctions did not work. What could have worked better than sanctions? If you do not include this idea, this dimension into the analysis, and then you're missing 90% of the picture. Anything is better good according to the alternatives. This is also true for sanctions. Iran, 2012, sanctions don't work, then what? You can do nothing, you can lift the sanctions and think and play like nothing is happening, or you can use what many people are actually supporting, military force, okay? If you put the situation in this perspective, how are sanctions doing? Is it true the sanctions are not working? Or basically sanctions might do things that might achieve things that no other foreign policy tool can achieve unless we go down with the military force. And every time we go down the line of military force, we know how we start, we never know how it ends, how we begin. That's a very nice quotation from generals. Military plans are made to be changed as soon as you start using them. Okay, so that's the other thing. With these two perspectives, again, how sanctions can affect targets and in comparative utility, and then we might think many ways in which sanctions have been used, and probably sanctions was the best way of going about certain things, and sanctions was the best tool that comparatively led to the results that we wanted to achieve. So again, this is just to begin. I probably talk too much as usual, but again, you know myself. You have to stop me otherwise. So. But thank you very much for this.
I was just to send some signalinks.
Okay.
Signalinks,
Yeah.
to say that. Yeah, actually,
thank you very much. I do not have cards because I forgot them in the hotel, so if you need to write my email, just use these. So, and then write me, whatever.
Now, floor is yours, and I do not want to summary of those because it was so clear, and then I mean that for the sanctions and then how it works in the many cases, how the international institutions, the UN and the EU are taking care of the sanctions, how they are effective or not. Floor is yours now, and then all comments and questions are welcome. I have one. Go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francesco, for this very, analytical and informative speech. Just before, there are a lot of things in my mind, especially as you said, regarding the situation in the Middle East. But one thing right now deserves my attention more when we think, especially the role of the international media in the international policies and sanctions. You mentioned that in Rwanda case, for example, the coverage of the slaughtering, for example, by the media had some sort of triggered the process for beginning to the sanctions. So, are there any case regarding that? I just remember some pieces, for example, which are calling about the CNN effect. The capacity of the international media outlets to affect the dynamics of the world politics in general, including the sanctions also altogether. In my opinion, it is much more effective, or it may be much more effective, because, as you said, the sanctions have also a huge dimension of the humanitarian, disasters. So every scene, every picture may easily touch into the hearts of the people or the international public in general. So, is there any other example for that apart from Rwanda? The second one, as we see, in the domestic policy regarding the, ruling and the media relations. Is there any instances, for example, cases in which these international coverages had been misused or, used to legitimize the sanction, which could be very hard otherwise in the normal terms, for example?
Can you reframe the second question, because
yeah, is there any kind of misuse, or is there any kind of usage of the international media outlets to legitimize, for example, those sanctions otherwise would be very hard to be bought by the international, international public in general? Just, by saying that I remember Bush administration, legitimation efforts of the Iraq occupation, by using these international media, especially BBC, and then after that creates a lot of problems, resulting with the resignation of these BBC people, and, also the contrary situation by the other international media outlets. So that would be the main frame.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much. This is a very interesting element, because sanctions are sometimes used, again, as I was in the prelude, in the premise, I was talking how sanctions are seen sometimes as an alternative to the use of force. So sometimes the dynamics that lead to the imposition of sanctions are very similar to the use of force. For the CNN effect, for example, is one case. I can think of, I can think, and that also ties to the second, the attempt of using the media to actually get a consensus to impose sanctions was the case of Syria. It was a failed attempt, but there was a lot of campaigning from the Western powers to go out and saying how that's in the moment when all the Western states, the prime ministers, the presidents came out and said Assad has to leave, because they were basically trying to create the momentum for the Security Council to make the decision to pass something that Libya was, created basically. This idea of, doing, authorizing all the necessary means to protect the civilians. It failed because a couple of states vetoed the resolution, but there was the attempt. So replying first to the first question, there is a clear understanding that the media and how and what governments do is really, affected by their own citizens and by the public opinion. And this is something that is done it's known. So media are used by leaders to create consensus, especially when we talk about UN sanctions, because there is this need. And you're totally right when you talked about the Iraqi case. The Iraqi case in 2003, the building up of the consensus worked for over 1 year. The idea of going around and trying to make the case for the WMDs, democracy, the problem of Saddam's and all the bad things that Saddam was doing was really an accurate attempt to work. It failed, but still that reflects the idea and the understanding that leaders know that international media are really powerful. And then going to the first question, whether international media affected the decision of other sanctions. Openly and clearly, the UN, in the case of the UN, probably the one that I can think better than any other is Darfur. In the case of Darfur, and this problem has been going on for a while before actually the UN was able to do anything. That was created by the media, but the fact that everybody started to talk about it, it became an important issue in the US. Colin Powell came out and he was the only one using the word genocide. There was a movement mounting, and then a movement being created and increasing for the Security Council to do something about Darfur, and actually something was done. Again, the signaling effect. Sanctions in Darfur are really light. But the Security Council had to do something because everybody was complaining that the international community was not doing anything about it. So I think that Darfur is another case that is justifiable. And the other case in which you can also say that the media effect does not always work is Somalia. Somalia is a case that, especially after the Black Hawk Down, everybody's been talking about Somalia. Many people know that Somalia is quite a mess. Sanctions have been imposed the last time in 1995, and then for 7 years you do not see any sanctions until Somalia becomes relevant for the Al-Qaeda problem. Terrorism and piracy. And these two things together in 2002, Somalia pops up in the agenda, not because of the people suffering, but because of other security threats. So I think that the media effect sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't work. And I'm not able to tell you when it does and when it does not, but for sure it is an element that it works sometimes to justify and to trigger sanctions. We also have cases from the EU, Myanmar, Burma, or Uzbekistan. If you look at who was chairing the presidency of the EU when sanctions have been imposed, it was the UK. Many of NGOs, working or caring about Uzbekistan are based in London. And the EU imposed sanctions against actually the will of many states. Germany and some of the other states in Europe did not want to impose sanctions on Uzbekistan because they didn't see the point in doing so. But since, again, the presidency was in the UK was quite exposed to the media problem, and then there was this, the need to do something about it, and the London and the government of the UK was able to put this on the agenda, and the EU imposed sanctions. So, there is this pressure also on sanctions.
Question?
Even among us. Even a long one, no problem.
Yeah, okay. Your answer is always long, right? Yeah,
No,
the
no.
question is, do you think there is a relationship between the sanctions itself and the structure of the UN Security Council? Because you know that there's a second World War structure, and do you think it's working in today's multilateral world, and how it can be redefined and restructured so also the sanctions can be more effective today?
Yes, there is. Of course, if you look where sanctions have been imposed in the past 20 years, a good idea could have been to show you the map. But you see that the countries in which sanctions have been imposed reflect quite directly the composition of the Security Council. We were talking last weekend. We were in San Diego and talking to exactly on this point and thinking that there is a discussion on how to reform the Security Council, and if the Security Council had a different configuration with the power being distributed in a different way, then you would see sanctions imposed in other cases. Let's say Russia is the only country, then you would see them in Georgia, you will see them in the Caucasus, and you will see them in different ways. It's a political tool. And so the political structure in the council reflects directly, yes. And how to change it? Well, there is an ongoing debate. On the one hand, the debates, part of the debate says that the wider is the international cooperation, the more effective a sanction will be. Let's say if this room is the system, we want to sanction you, the more we are deciding and all of us is decided to sanction you, the more it will be effective. The other side of the coin is the more people decide, or the more countries, in the case of the UN Security Council resolution, the more countries can decide, they can basically veto the resolution, the broader has to be the compromise, and the lighter will be whatever you decide at the end. And so even if everybody is willing to impose sanctions, the sanctions at the end of the line will be so, to make everybody happy, they will be so light and vague that they will not make any impact. So you have these two extremes that you have to balance when we think about the Security Council and how we structure the power within it.
We will have one or two more questions. Yeah, I have one question, in fact. Actually, that's why I was waiting for yesterday. I want to ask, but today it's okay for me to have a chance to ask question. Relating to, that we must speak about international organizations and then international orientation. But my question is mostly the regional conditionalities and which country is just which is a case of the sanctions, which faced with the sanctions that has an impact also to its neighborhood, and then how these countries are the neighboring countries are affected so badly. That the cost of these sanctions to the neighboring countries, how this affects the decision-making procedure, especially in terms of the political mechanism within the EU. Let's say first the EU case, and then for the UN it can be understandable without these veto powers that we will left the UN, but focusing on mostly to the EU.
No, it's a very interesting question. The EU basically decides by consensus, so they try always to agree. If there is some country who's actually affected more, they'll try to find compensatory measures, as the case of Greece with the case of Iran. So and there are also rumors that that decision was also connected to the financial aid that Greece is receiving from the European Union. The decisions were made at the same time. So there are also rumors that these two discussions were linked, and the compensatory measure was Greece to not veto the oil embargo on Iran, and it would be easier for you to get the money that you need, not to go bankrupt. So that was kind of also one. So just to say that the compensatory measures are not only related, might not be only related to the actual topic or economic issue that you're discussing, oil in that case, but it can also be linked to other fields. And then another thing that you see in the EU is that there are clear connections in between certain states and certain sanctions. Zimbabwe. Nobody cares about Zimbabwe in the EU, but one state. And this state is deciding everything. Cote d'Ivoire. Same story. Who is deciding about Cote d'Ivoire? Is it Sweden that wanted to go to Cote d'Ivoire? Is it Spain? There are all these, and it's more logic. And then there are cases that are controversial. Sometimes sanctions are not imposed. So the regional, the European dynamic does not find the solution. Other times, as we were discussing, since you need unanimity to decide sanctions, you impose something so light that materially there is not an impact. Uzbekistan. The UK wanted to impose sanctions. Germany did not want to impose sanctions. In other states, because Uzbekistan was a key country for Afghanistan, for logistics, they imposed a very light sanction. So they wanted to satisfy the need of someone wanting to say, we impose sanctions on Uzbekistan, with the other side of the coin saying we cannot really affect the trade relations or our connection with them because we need, there were soldiers there. It's very interesting how this was played out in Uzbekistan. Andijan, May 2005. The EU imposes sanctions in November. Uzbekistan kicks out the Americans. They do not kick out the Germans in the southern part. They have a military base in the southern part of Uzbekistan. The Germans stay there. And the US did not impose sanctions on Uzbekistan. So you see how these, so there was a political agreement in the EU. Basically everybody knew what was going to happen, and the Uzbeks also were familiar with one specific country and the trade that they could have had with that specific country. So to answer, again, I would say that to answer to your question, there is no one single answer, but there are different patterns that you can see in different regions according to the state and according to the negotiation that goes within the European Union. But there is a very strong negotiation in the EU, also because without the negotiation you would not have sanctions. I mean, one country could say, I veto it, that decision doesn't even go to the Council, so it's, and you don't even see that there is a disagreement, but the EU would not impose sanctions.
I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And then I would like to thank Francesco for very deliberative speech and then for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks. Yes.